Hi, I'm Paul Fotenauer, and welcome to Frontiers, where we showcase UC Davis research that helps us understand and live in a changing world. Immigration is the civil rights issue for this generation. It has become a big global business that is pulling more people into exploitation, indentured servitude, and slavery. How immigrants are treated raises questions for human rights, politics, and the economy. And yet at the same time, with the heightened fears of terrorism, vast numbers of undocumented immigrants trigger concerns about national security and the use of public resources. Today, we're going to talk to two UC Davis scholars who study the global trends in immigration and the policy and civil rights issues for undocumented immigrants living in the shadows. The plight of immigrant farm workers has concerned sociologist David Kyle since he was a child growing up in Florida, down the road from a large commercial farm. He has spent his career studying international immigration in its many forms, including slavery and human trafficking. In fact, Professor Kyle's second book, Global Human Smuggling, became one of the first academic books to examine this issue in different regions of the world. Kevin Johnson grew up with relatives on both sides of the Mexican-U.S. border and family members whose immigration status varied. A professor of law and Chicano studies, he focuses his research on the legal and ethical issues of immigration and civil rights. He is the author of How Did You Get to Be Mexican and the Huddled Masses Myth. Professor Johnson provides leadership with Legal Services of Northern California and the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Gentlemen, welcome to Frontiers.
Thanks for having us.
First question, David, is you say that immigration has become just not a means to an end, but a highly profitable global business. How so?
That's right, Paul. All over the world now we have people who are profiting over what we would just call migration services of all sorts. It could be legal, but often they are illegal activities. For example, smuggling would be the one that really concerns us here today. And this is highly profitable because you really need no startup capital. You really don't need that many skills. You really only need the desire to export people in some ways. These kinds of activities range from criminal syndicates to kind of mom and pop organizations.
Well, let me follow up on the criminal smugglers. What impact are they having?
The criminal smugglers are having mostly an impact in the area of what we call human trafficking. And this is when migrants become slaves. They become tricked. They're tricked into slavery. They think that they're being smuggled to a job, and in the end, they find out that it's really slavery.
Now, Kevin, you don't think increased border enforcement is the answer. Why not?
What we've seen over the last 10 years is a dramatic increase in border enforcement. President Clinton put together a couple of high-profile operations along the border that have made it much more deadly to cross the border. Thousands of people have died, and human trafficking has gone up. In fact, fees for smuggling have gone up dramatically from a few $100s in the 1990s to a few $1,000s today. People keep coming to the United States. It's lucrative to traffic them to the United States, and they're able to find jobs relatively easily in the United States. Employers employ undocumented workers. Undocumented workers can get employment. And what we've seen over the last 10 years, despite the most dramatic increase in border enforcement in U.S. history, is a doubling of the undocumented immigrant population from about 5 million to roughly around 12 million today. So what we see is it's had deadly impacts, and it's had little impact on the undocumented immigrant population.
So in spite of the threat of death, that these immigrants are still taking the risk in coming to the United States?
There are hundreds of people a day. I was down in south of Tucson a few months ago in a small town called Altad, Mexico, and it was a sleepy little town a few months ago, about 6 months ago, and it's become a big center for border crossing, and there's a large business of people who will drive people close to the border over roads. There are people who will walk through the desert in the middle of the night with their family, coming to the United States for jobs. People are willing to risk life and limb, literally, to come to this country for work.
Now, David, immigrants are finding ingenious ways to enter into this country where they can avoid Border Patrol agents. How do they do that?
Any way they can. I mean, the numbers of strategies are increasing every day. I'm always surprised every time I focus on a new country or go there. I just got back from doing some research in Fiji, and every single country has some similarities with other countries and how they do it, but they also have unique ways of doing it. Overall, though, they're using the same globalization, transportation, and communication technologies that we all use. But I think that we have to distinguish between those who are kind of smuggled in the dead of night, say across the Mexican border, and those who are overstaying visas by getting in through some kind of legal means. But the overall strategy is still a smuggling strategy because it's about overcoming U.S. immigration and labor laws.
Can you give me some specific examples of some of these ingenious ways?
Well, one of the most ingenious ways was where some Chinese refitted a cargo ship, a cargo container, with air conditioning, cooking utensils, and they were in that hold for months, sealed in a container, and in a perfectly livable container, and were offloaded here in the U.S.
Do you think that more of that goes on than we realize?
Undoubtedly, much more of that goes on than we realize. I think that the cases that we know of are simply the ones that didn't do a very good job. So there's always a problem in social research where we're only looking at those people who got caught, because there's a pattern there. And when I do research in the sending countries, it becomes more obvious of how many people have been actually successful.
And Kevin, how would you characterize the life of an undocumented immigrant that's in this country? Is life easy or is it hard?
Well, I think it's extremely difficult, Paul. Undocumented immigrants, as President Bush has acknowledged, live in the shadows of American life. They're subject to exploitation in many jobs. They can be subject to slavery and voluntary servitude. Many of them have to work to pay off their smuggling debt once into the United States. And even in California, we've seen an increase in slavery and enslavement of immigrants. We also see the failure of employers in many instances to comply with basic minimum wage and condition laws. We see a situation where many undocumented immigrants can't even drive a car without fear of being removed from the country and uprooted from their life in the United States. So it's a very difficult life on the margins, very difficult to establish the kinds of roots that we expect people to establish here once they're in this country. And it's really a shame the way that many undocumented immigrants are treated in sort of the periphery of American social life, even though they give a great deal to this country in terms of economic benefits. I mean, we have undocumented immigrants and immigrant workers in construction, domestic service, other service industries, farm work, and make important contributions to the economy that they often don't credit for, where they are able to help us keep prices down for poultry and produce, for housing, for hotels and restaurants. It's really a situation where we have an important part of our labor force that's not protected by the laws, that's exploited and demeaned at every turn.
Once they're here, what are the legal obstacles to get them to stay in this country?
Well, under the law, some of them might be eligible for certain types of relief after a period of time, but many who come to this country didn't have a lawful way of entering into the United States. The immigration laws are fairly restrictive, and for people from certain countries, you'd have to wait a very long time before you could immigrate to the United States. To immigrate lawfully under certain kinds of visas from the Philippines and India and Mexico, three very high immigrant sending countries in the United States, you might have to wait 10 to 20 years. If you're from other countries like the United Kingdom or Spain, you might have to wait a year or two. So one of the things people don't realize when they talk about undocumented immigrants, when they say they should wait in line, that the lines differ by different countries. And some people may not even have a line to get into because of the restrictive nature of immigration laws. So one of the reasons that Congress this year was talking about a legalization program of some sort was to bring people who've been in this country for a prolonged period of time, who've made contributions to our economy, who are part of our communities, who work here, to make sure that they could somehow regularize their status. That's sort of gotten bottlenecked in Congress, but that's one of the things that President Bush raised.
And David, is there a link between migrant trade then and slave trade?
Yes, absolutely. If we didn't have the large numbers, as Kevin has said, the increase in migrant smuggling leads to the opportunities for criminal syndicates as the bottom feeders of this phenomena to trick and take advantage of these migrants, especially in the vulnerable process of trying to cross a border, it's very easy to really kind of pick them off and turn them into slaves. And we see this all over the world. This isn't just a U.S.-Mexico issue.
Now we know that this past spring and summer, proposed immigration reform stirred thousands to protest in this country. What do these marches mean for the future of immigration and civil rights?
To me, it's uncertain precisely what they mean. I think that the marches in the spring of 2006 were really unprecedented in United States history. You had immigrants, immigrant supporters, citizens, not just Latino immigrants. In Chicago, you had Polish immigrants. In Boston, you had Irish immigrants. It was hundreds of thousands of people who were taken to the streets, who were protesting, at least initially protesting, the very punitive provisions of the Sensenbrenner bill. Later on, some of the later marches in the spring talked about justice for immigrants and amnesty for immigrants and the undocumented immigrants who've been in this country. In the long term, it's unclear to me whether this immigrant rights movement is going to transform into a more general civil rights movement or is going to kind of fizzle out. And at this point, it seems like it may have fizzled out a bit. But it certainly showed, I think, Congress that the very punitive provisions that had been in the Sensenbrenner bill just weren't going to cut it.
Well, a question for both of you on this topic. How should U.S. immigration policy be reformed? David?
Well, I'd like to also I'll answer that question by picking up on something that Kevin just said, which is, and your question was the meaning of this. I think that in some ways we have as much, not only just a civil rights, have a new civil rights movement on our hands, or when we look at this, but also sort of anti-prohibition movement, in the sense that the economic and social and cultural forces here are so much greater than what we're trying to do on the border. I mean, they would not be coming here if we didn't have the jobs. And we really see this as a global phenomenon. We talk about globalization. We tell other countries that you need to find something to export. And so that's exactly what they're doing. And as Kevin said, they wouldn't be coming here if we didn't have jobs. So if we look at it as an anti-prohibition movement, it's a somewhat different phenomena. Think of any other kind of criminal group, if we want to characterize illegal migrants as criminals, as some do. Buchanan just came out with a book talking about the invasion of the third world and kind of advocating even deeper criminalization of these migrants. I would say, though, I don't see cocaine dealers taking to the streets in large numbers. I think this is a clue that this is an economic phenomena, and they don't feel that this is a real crime, and I think with some reason. On the other hand, I think the American public has a right to have some answers. What is going on here? What would it take? I think that until there's a sort of global understanding of some of these economic processes and understanding of why they're coming here, I don't think that any policies or enforcement strategies on the border will stop this.
And Kevin?
I think David's absolutely right. We're at a point in our history where we have immigration laws that are just inconsistent with the economic realities of immigration. We have immigration laws that make it difficult for employers who want workers. We have immigration laws that make it difficult for immigrant workers who want to work in the United States. We need a set of immigration laws that are much more consistent with our economic, social, and political needs than currently exist. Over the last few years, we have immigration laws and policies that have focused on enforcement only, that have tried to close the door on immigration. In the Sensenbrenner bill was one of those. We have focused unduly in recent years on national security, in my estimation, and not enough on really the bread and butter economic issues that involve immigration. The one thing that I guess I want to add about the protests in the spring, that they were very important in a number of ways. And I think that many minorities, particularly Latinos, realize that the discussion and debate about immigration in no small part is about race. And when you read some of these look at some of these websites, read Pat Buchanan's book, read Samuel Huntington's book, which has a chapter on the Hispanicization of immigration, realize this isn't just about economics, it's not just about national security, it's also about national identity. It's also about the race of the people coming to the United States. And I think that we have to address those issues and think about those issues and not bury them in our immigration laws.
Let me talk about security. It's been 5 years since the attacks of September 11th. How does this country reconcile illegal immigration with national security concerns?
How does it reconcile it in the sense of how does one affect the other? I would say that we can't understand the border buildup without our fear of terrorism and our desire to control terrorists coming in. And this goes back to the first bombing of the World Trade Center. It was when the offense started going up in '95. This was one of the things that the government was saying. It's less publicized than the kind of anti-immigrant side of things, but in part it was a desire to control who's coming in. I think a misplaced strategy, but that was partly what was driving it. I think that security issues is a serious concern on the border. I also agree with Kevin that a lot of this anti-immigrant rhetoric and control of the border is driven by racism as well. But there is a legitimate concern about border security and terrorism. I happen to think, though, that the strategies we've been pursuing on the border won't get us to where we're trying to go in terms of controlling terrorism. After all, most of the 9/11 bombers didn't cross in the dead of night or the U.S.-Mexico border or even the Canadian border. Some did over Canada through the Canadian border, but not over the Mexican border. They will always find a way to get in if they want to.
Let me ask you this. Shaping immigration policy for Congress, is this going to be settled at the ballot box?
To me, it's a political question that Congress in this nation is going to have to address in the 21st century. It may not be this year, may not be next year, but politically, we're going to have to come up with an immigration law and policy that makes sense for the country. Unfortunately, throughout our history, we've sort of dropped the ball when it's come to making sense in immigration law and policy. We made some deep and enduring mistakes. But in my estimation, it's not going to come from the United States Constitution. It's not going to come from the courts. It's going to come from people and legislatures, and that's where the change is going to come. And it's going to take some time, because I think incidents like September 11th and the security concerns that they raise are legitimate ones, very legitimate security concerns, sometimes come to dominate immigration law and policy and almost have become a myopic focus of immigration law and policy since September 11th. But if you're really worried about national security, you should be worried about things like the fact that we have so little enforcement along the northern border with Canada, when in fact apparently the only alleged terrorist who's ever tried to enter the country came from Canada, the Millennium Bomber in 1999. And that gives sort of fodder to the people who say it's all about race, or it's largely about race. We're militarizing the U.S.-Mexico border and we're ignoring the Canadian border. But I also think that if you're really worried about security and national security, and I am, you have to come up with a system where you have some kind of record of the identities and addresses of undocumented immigrants who are living in the United States, if that's what you're truly interested in.
I'd like to thank both of you for appearing on Frontiers.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you who joined us for today's discussion. You can learn more about this subject by visiting our website at frontiers.ucdavis.edu. Few scientific subjects are as controversial as race, and a few are as popular as food, diet, and health. Now scientists and physicians are learning that our ancestry can determine how likely we are to suffer from some common chronic diseases, and how what we eat can change those risks. Here to discuss these issues is Ray Rodriguez, professor of molecular and cellular biology at UC Davis. Professor Rodriguez has directed the Center of Excellence for Nutritional Genomics since it was established in 2003 with a grant from the National Institutes of Health. A pioneer in genetic engineering, Professor Rodriguez holds 16 patents and has developed technologies that are the foundation of the biotechnology industry. He has worked with the Human Genome Project and established the organization that laid the groundwork for mapping the rice genome. Professor Rodriguez, thanks for being a part of Frontiers.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's nice to see you again.
Good. Nice to see you as well. Ray, let's start with the basics. What is nutritional genomics?
Well, Paul, nutritional genomics is really one of the most exciting new sort of spin-offs of the Human Genome Project. It looks at the whole human genome in response to nutrition. A lot of scientists are talking about the interaction between diet or genes and environment, and probably the most important component or factor of the environment for humans is diet. So we believe that our genotype will determine how we respond to foods. I like to say that we bring two things to the dinner table, our appetite and our genotype. You may have seen a number of advertisements for cholesterol-lowering drugs that say that there's two sources of cholesterol, your food and your family history. That's basically a nutritional genomic message. researchers now understanding, and this is fairly recent sort of revelation, that the things that we eat are not only used to generate energy that allows us to get through the day, but they're also turning on and turning off genes. And like I said, this is relatively new. About 10 years ago, people began to realize that, yes, we not only utilize nutrients for energy, but they actually control our genes.
So what are you trying to achieve in the center?
Well, we're trying to look for those diet-gene interactions that are responsible for increasing our risk for certain diseases, or alternatively, for those diet-gene interactions that promote health. You know, in the 21st century, we're faced with really the serious diseases. You know, we're left with what we call chronic diseases, age-related diseases. These include cardiovascular disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So those are tough diseases. There's no single gene, there's no infectious agent, there's no single factor that causes those diseases. And there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that it's the interaction between the genes that we inherit from our parents and how those genes are influenced by environmental factors like diet and lifestyle that cause these diseases.
So what is the connection with race?
Well, that's an interesting point. You know, for many years, race was essentially considered a social construct. It has political and social overtones that are not very pleasant to certain people. But when we started sequencing the human genome, for 10 years as the genome was being sequenced, all the researchers were constantly talking about how similar the human genome was. That, matter of fact, they would say that we are 99.9% identical at the DNA level, which made us, as they say, genetically identical twins. But now that the human genome is sequenced, we realize that there are a number of small differences, and those are differences that we can see just between you and me. Those obvious morphological differences, those phenotypic differences that everybody in this room has. Those differences are reflected in our physiology and our biochemistry, and they also influence our risk for disease. So now researchers are trying to find those little differences between individuals. We call them common genetic variants.
Give me an example of that.
Well, there's a classic example is a type 2 diabetes. You know, this is a very complicated disease that involves probably hundreds of genes. Now, there are certain variants of those genes. One is called calpain-10, and this genetic variant, it's not a mutation. I want to make sure that we're not talking about mutations. This is a flavor of that gene. So everybody's got calpain-10. Some people have a version of calpain-10 that increases dramatically their risk for type 2 diabetes. It turns out that the people who inherit that version, that variant of calpain-10 are primarily Mexican American or Mexican mestizo. That variant in white Caucasians or in African Americans or in Asian doesn't seem to be associated with type 2 diabetes. So what we're understanding that we inherit blocks of genes from our ancestors. We'll call them our geographical ancestors or continental races. And when those variants are confronted with a different type of diet, for example, in the U.S., a very calorie-rich diet with lots of fats, saturated fats, lots of refined carbohydrates, we see the consequences of that genetic variant. And what we see is a dramatic increase in obesity followed by type 2 diabetes.
So are there any broad generalizations about race, about genes and health that are true, or can they be dismissed as urban legend?
Well, I think there are. You know, we've always heard about individuals who can eat anything they want and they don't gain weight. We've heard about individuals who can eat all the fat products, all the dairy, whole milk, ice cream, and their cholesterol levels stay the same. That's true. You know, it's not an urban myth that their genetic makeup allows them to metabolize fats and cholesterols in such a way that they never see it in terms of their LDL levels.
Now, the Center for Nutritional Genomics recently sponsored a conference on race, genomics, and medicine. What were you hoping to achieve with the conference?
Well, that was a very interesting conference, and I think it was a timely one because since we're talking about genetic variants, now remember, we view race as sort of a crude proxy for genetic variation. There's genetic variation in the human population, and that variation can be traced to various continents, which can be traced back to Africa. So, you know, I'm a proponent of the out of Africa theory that our ancestors came out of Africa and migrated. So, until recently, the only terms we had to use were white, black. Some people would refer to Asian or African American. Those terms really don't hold up. They don't serve us well scientifically now that we have the human genome.
So is this going to complicate self-description?
It is. And what we're seeing is a transition away from these social-based terms, which were actually, and this is very interesting, these terms of white and black, the yellow man, the red man, were developed by a plant taxonomist back in the 1700s. Carolus Linnaeus, who developed the plant taxonomic system for classifying all plants. After he had done that, he decided that he would start to classify human beings. And he sort of got it right. What he was looking at were differences, sort of superficial differences that he could see in people, which sort of reflect genetic differences in underneath or beneath. So, but that really isn't serving us well enough right now. So we need to talk about what we call geographic ancestry.
So what came out of the conference? Any specifics?
Yes. Well, there's a couple of very interesting things that came out. First of all, we got people talking about race, and I think in a very enlightened fashion. There are people who are concerned about giving up their ability to self-identify. There are people who may want to be called African American or Mexican American, where a scientist can come in and using new technologies can tell you exactly what % African genes you have, what % European genes you have. We call this genetic admixture. So there was this sort of a dichotomy between what people want to call themselves and what scientists can determine genetically. So we started that discussion. The other interesting thing is that the publishing, scientific publishing industry, particularly the New England Journal of Medicine, has a policy about classifying various races in their studies. There was an interesting study involving a drug called Bidil, which actually reduces the frequency of heart failure among individuals who have had heart attacks. It turns out this drug's been around for many years, and it was just barely effective. Matter of fact, its effectiveness was so weak the FDA didn't want to approve it. When they went back and looked at the populations that were being treated, and they sorted them by race, and they just did this, they were just looking for something to do. They sorted them by race. It turned out that this drug had a tremendous benefit for African Americans, and it had practically no benefit at all for whites. So this was an example of a sort of a race-based drug. And there was a lot of interest in whether there will be a drug for whites, and whether we are now in sort of on the verge of new personalized medicines, drugs that are developed just for you and your genotype.
Ray, this is a fascinating topic. I wish we had more time, but thank you for coming on.
You're welcome,
we'll
Paul.
talk about this as the months continue.
Okay.
And thanks to all of you who joined us for today's discussion. And you can learn more about this subject by visiting our website at frontiers.ucdavis.edu.